Chapter 2, Section 1 is about Mesopotamia. Page 38 has a map that you can look at so you can kind of figure out what we're talking about as we go through our notes. Mesopotamia is Greek, meaning land between the rivers. And what two rivers are we talking about? Those are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Tigris is on top, the Euphrates is on the bottom, and really when you look at that map, the green shaded area kind of oozes out of the borders, not just in between the rivers, but outside it as well, and that is called the Fertile Crescent. And that's the fertile land area where the Mesopotamians lived from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. Now, they didn't have much rain because it was primarily a desert, but when the rivers flooded, it deposited years of silt, and that's what allowed them to be able to farm and what created the rich soil. Now, they did have flooding, but it wasn't due to rains. It was due to the snow melt in the spring from the mountains that were further up north. So to control that unpredictable flooding, they had to build irrigation and drainage ditches. Ancient Mesopotamia is divided into three regions: Assyria, Akkad, and Sumer. When you look at this map, you can see here Assyria is in the northern portion, Akkad is in the middle, and Sumer is in the south. Sumer is the location of the first Mesopotamian civilization. In Sumer, you can see the city-states of Babylon, Uruk, Ur, and Eridu, and those are all city-states, which are independent regions that are really no more larger than a city. All right, on your map, on the last page of your packet, we are going to label these places that I have highlighted green. The first one is the Tigris River. That would be letter B on your map. Euphrates, that is letter D on your map. Mediterranean Sea, that is letter C on your map. Persian Gulf is letter N on your map. And that pixely gray region around the Tigris and Euphrates River is Mesopotamia, and that is letter H on your map. All right, the Sumerian city-states were all constructed very similarly, where they had walls around them. For example, the walls along Uruk were 6 miles long, and then they manned those towers every 30 to 35 feet. They constructed small houses, but they also had larger buildings, temples and such, based on their religion, and it was made out of sun-dried bricks, typically mud and clay combinations. They used the architectural features of the arch and the dome, and those are still used in Southwest Asia today. The ziggurat temples that I just mentioned are in honor of a chief god or goddess of each Sumerian city-state. Although they worshipped many gods, they picked a chief or a main god, and this ziggurat temple was a really large stepped tower, and it was usually in the center of the city because religion and government were intertwined, and the markets were also built around it. We don't really know the exact height, but usually anywhere from 5 to 7 layers, and the largest layer was at the bottom, and it went up smaller like a wedding cake, again made out of that mud and clay brick, and really only parts of it exist today. There is a picture on page 39 of a ziggurat temple, but it is a reconstructed version, not an original. So when we look at this temple, you can see that there are stairs that go up the front 3 different directions, from the right, the left, and the center. And when you get here, you have a landing, and you have the arched doorways, which we mentioned that they used. It has a dome over it, and then you continue on up the steps to this altar that's at the very top. No Sumerians went into the temple. The priests, primarily, it wasn't like a church where everyone would sit down and worship this god. It was really for offerings, and the priests would go in and make those offerings and talk to the gods. Sometimes there was vegetation, like plants and trees and shrubs and flowers growing on it. And again, no windows because you didn't go inside of it. Mesopotamia was ruled governmentally by a theocracy. And a theocracy is where the gods select the kings, not elections by the people. And so the priest or priestess were really close, kind of the second-hand man to the king. Since the kings were given the power to rule from the gods, religion and government were closely connected. The kings also were in charge of the armies. They had to supervise building of like ziggurats and other large public works, and they organized workers on irrigation projects. So the army, the priests, and all of the government assistants all assisted the king so that he could do his job. As far as farming and trading goes for Mesopotamia, they traded a lot of things that they were very good at making. In particular, they were very good at working with metal, especially bronze, and so they made tools and weapons out of bronze and traded those. They had a lot of sheep, so they were able to make wool. They had lots of clay, so they made pottery. They had access to 2 rivers and 2 seas, so they had a lot of dried fish. And in a drier climate, they could grow barley and wheat. Now on the map, you can see the trade route. It was a perfect location, a strategic location to go from the Mediterranean Sea down through Mesopotamia and out through the Persian Gulf into the Arabian Sea over to India. So it was a great location for trading. So what did they want to get from other people? Since they were great at working with metal, they wanted to import more copper and tin to make more bronze. And since they didn't have trees, they wanted to import cedar. Now the wood that they imported, or the cedar wood, was primarily used for boats or ships. And so with the invention of a sail and having cedar wood, clearly they were great at building ships. The wheel was not used for human transportation, but primarily for wheeled carts, and so it was transporting goods, not people. There were 3 major social groups: upper class, which were the nobles. It was the king and his family and the priest and his family. Everyone else, commoners, anybody that was had a skill, were merchants, fishers, craftspeople, or 90% of the population were farmers. And the lowest was slaves. So this is a very common social class system. And the slaves were in charge of building those large temples, weaving cloth, especially the wool, and grinding some of the grain that they would use, and for farming some of the land. All right, the very first empire in ancient history was the Akkadians, and they ruled from 2340 to 2100 BC. Their leader was Sargon the Great, and he established an empire, which is a large political unit, usually under one ruler, like Sargon the Great, that controls many territories. Now, the Akkadians didn't really cover or control a lot of area, but it was just the region of Akkadia and Mesopotamia. They ended under large attacks, and the Babylonians took over. The Babylonians were from the city of Babylon, and they ruled from 1792 until their leader, Hammurabi, died in 1750. Hammurabi was a very good leader, and there's a little excerpt on page 41 that talks about Hammurabi and what a good military leader and person he was. And it says, Hammurabi built temples and irrigation canals, encouraged trade, and brought an economic revival. Hammurabi was also a man of war. He had a well-disciplined army of foot soldiers who carried axes, spears, and copper or bronze daggers. So very good at being a leader. Hammurabi's biggest contribution are going to be his set of laws, and we will address that in just a little bit. All right, on our maps, we have labeled the Tigris River, the Euphrates River, the Mediterranean Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the region of Mesopotamia. Now go ahead and label Babylon, which is letter M on your map. All right, the Code of Hammurabi was a set of written laws, and it's highlighted in orange because it was the first set of written laws ever, And so that is an invention or creation that people use today. Of course, we have books and books of written laws in our country, but he had a code that consisted of 282 laws. They were very strict, and punishments were different depending on if you're upper class, middle class, or lower class, or if you're a man or a woman. One of the laws, law number 196, states, if a free man has destroyed the eye of a member of the aristocracy, they shall destroy his eye. And law number 198 says, if he has destroyed the eye of a commoner or broken the bone of a commoner, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. This just gives you a good idea about some of the strict laws and how they were treated differently. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth is a saying that we use today, meaning equal retribution. In other words, we will use this in our death penalty in our country. If you kill someone, you will be killed as well. So it's talking about equal retribution. They did not have police, so it was up to public officials to catch whoever perpetrated the crimes, and if they didn't, then they would be the ones to pay restitution to those victims. And so that was not a good deal. Judges also could lose their jobs if they didn't rule correctly. Many of the 282 codes was dealing with consumer protection. In other words, if you made a faulty hammer, how are we going to treat that? So an example here is about a carpenter or a builder of the buildings. If it collapses and falls on the owner of the home and kills him, then the carpenter could be put to death, or might just have to replace the things that were damaged. Marriage and family was also the largest category in his 282 laws. There was arranged marriages, and it was all based on a marriage contract, so a lot of the laws had to do with that. Mesopotamia was a patriarchal society, and society was dominated by men, and women had fewer rights. They were treated much differently as far as Hammurabi's laws applied. For example, if a woman could not have children or didn't have kids, the man could actually get a divorce. And of course, it would be the woman's fault why they wouldn't have children, not anyone else's. Obedience was expected, and if a son decided to hit his father, his hands could be cut off or they would disinherit him. So this is the real Code of Hammurabi here. It's an 8-foot tall slab with the 282 laws written on it, both on the front and the back, written in cuneiform. All right, religion was very important. They had most of their 3,000 gods and goddesses that were dealing with nature, and so they were a polytheistic society, and they did not worship the gods in the same sense that we worship our God, but really we were just there to serve them. As far as writing goes, the Sumerians used cuneiform, which was a wedge-shaped system of writing, and they wrote with a stylus that had a wedge shaped at the end, and they wrote on clay because that was what they had an abundance of. And its main use was keeping records. And so you would write down maybe amounts of grain that they had, or the time that you would plant or harvest. They would keep track of records and things like that, or transactions. The people that learned to write were called scribes, and they could serve as copyists, teachers, or jurists. They were usually boys, and that was considered to be a successful career to be a scribe. If you were a scribe, you could later on become very important in the city-states. These were, of course, only wealthy young boys, and they trained from boyhood until they were young men. School was rough. It started at sunrise, ended at sunset. Extreme discipline. In other words, if they didn't write correctly, if they were late or they didn't show up, they were caned, and they were taught by simply copying and recopying. All right, if you were a regular person that needed to keep information, you would do that through a cylinder seal, which you would press into the clay to sign, quote unquote, your name. They also had numbers, which were very similar to their letters. And as far as literature goes, the most important piece of literature was the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it was written on 12 clay tablets. All right, the most important piece of literature of Mesopotamia was the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was written on 12 clay tablets, and it's an epic poem about the life of Gilgamesh and the afterlife. All right, let's summarize with the Sumerian technology. We've already mentioned the wheel and the sail, the potter's wheel and the spinning wheel, the sundial, the arch and the dome, the use of bronze in creating the Bronze Age. In math, they had a system based on the number 60, which is what we used for time, and the multiplication and division charts, which we've used. And they've also charted star constellations to keep track of the time of the year. All right, on the last page of your packet, you have a summarizing sheet about all the different people in chapter 2. The Babylonians lived in Babylon, or Mesopotamia would also work. Today that is called Iraq. And the things that they invented, started, or created was the Code of Hammurabi, first code of laws. And an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth is used as capital punishment in our country today. Sumerians lived in Sumer, called Mesopotamia. Today it's Iraq. And they invented all the things we just mentioned: the wheel, sail, arch, dome, Epic of Gilgamesh, sundial, pottery wheel, spinning wheel, using number 60 as a math system, constellation charts, and multiplication and division tables. All right, you need to do the review on Canvas using your notes for section 1. You can also read the Epic of Gilgamesh summary and fill out a summary sheet for extra credit. And make sure you've read section 2 of chapter 2 for tomorrow.